Okay, so sorry, the mic is working. Right?
Yeah, so we can, Naomi, do you want to do a little?
Yeah, I will do the introduction today. I'm Naomi Kelman. I'm on the Maptime Davis Council. And I'm with Michelle Tobias and Alex Mandel and Vanessa Veronica. I'm so sorry, Herrera. I'm very sorry, I got that wrong. Are here today in the room, and today we are very happy to have Dariya Draganova. Oh goodness, Draganova. I almost got it. I'm sorry.
No, it's all good. It's all good.
Draganova
Yeah.
is joining us from GreenInfo Network to talk about the 30 by 30 initiative at Maptime. And before we begin, I just want to give a little intro to Maptime. If you are new here today, it is time for making maps. We here at UC Davis Maptime are a community of students, grad students, staff, affiliates.
Sorry.
That's okay. Staff, affiliates, community members, and we like to come together, give workshops, and talk about things that are map related and build community. So if you have suggestions or want to come out and meet us, come to the data lab for one of our things. You can always tune in online. We've got a YouTube channel and a website. Catch up if you want to. And with that, I'm going to let Dariya introduce herself. GreenInfo Network. One more thing, the 30 by 30 initiative. This will be she's our second speaker about the 30 by 30 initiative. If you want to see what Nate Roth at Department of Conservation talked about last year, that's also up on our YouTube channel. So we're really happy to hear more about this exciting project. And Dariya, take it away. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for inviting me. Sorry, I'm having difficulty going back to the initial screen. One moment while I navigate that. There we go. Okay, so my name is Dariya Draganova, and I am a GIS analyst at GreenInfo. Thank you for having me. I've been wanting to, I guess, get in touch with the GIS community here in Davis for some time, and I just haven't done so. So this is exciting for me. And I'm here today to talk to you about GreenInfo Network and tell you about what we do, who we are, and also to talk to you about 30 by 30, which is what I have personally, it's been a big chunk of my work. I would say the majority of my work over the last 11 months. Yeah, I started on this on January 1st of this year. So yeah, exactly 11 months that I've been had my head down on this particular project, which is very important. Okay, so let me get started here. So first I wanted to, I guess, ask, I was expecting there to be more people, so I was gonna ask how many people here are actually affiliated with UC Davis, and I don't know if you can tell me how many people that usually show up are actually like students here versus like community members. Is it mostly students or staff, etc.?
I think we get a lot of, I think we're mostly grad students and staff, faculty.
Yeah.
Alex and I are both alumni,
Yeah.
community members. But we have staff, grad student.
Awesome.
Here,
Okay.
I'm not sure, I can't see it online, but.
Yeah, I guess I don't know about people online if they want to put anything in the chat about that. And my other question was going to be how many of you are using open source GIS, whether that is things like QGIS or Awesome. Do you guys do any pandas or GeoPandas?
Yes.
Okay.
Just learning, but yeah.
Great. Okay. All right. So I'm just curious about that because I'm always interested in how many people are trying to embrace different ways of doing GIS. I have, as I'll show you later, I've done pretty much all of my 30 by 30 work is with GeoPandas and pandas. So I'm personally very excited about that. But yeah. Anyhow, let's get started. So I'll just spend the first part of this talk today telling about GreenInfo Network, who we are, what we do. I'm going to show you some of the projects that we've worked on. We're going to have like a 5-minute mental break where you guys can ask questions if you want, just so before we dive into the 30 by 30 part of the presentation, where I'll tell you what 30 by 30 is, what our role is within 30 by 30. And I'll show you some of the, examples, maybe some scripts or etc. And then maybe some bigger picture or kind of food for thought type things. So, okay, so GreenInfo Network. Our mission is to create, analyze, visualize, and communicate information in the public interest. We are a nonprofit organization founded in 1996. We mostly do a lot of GIS, but I guess we do half GIS and half website and web tool creation. So, but I would say that all of the people on our team can do GIS. I guess that's what I was trying to say. But we definitely do a lot of website development and geospatial like web tools for websites. We are a consultancy, nonprofit consultancy, and we do a lot of, a lot of our clients are other nonprofits or government agencies, or I mean, we I think have had some for-profit clients, but it's only on projects that are for the public and have a big, are supposed to be like benefiting the public. But I would say the vast majority of our clients are nonprofits and government agencies. We are also the publishers of CPAD and CCD. Do you guys know what that is? Do you know? Okay, so have you used them?
Yes.
Okay, so, I'll talk about them later. But yeah, that's a big part of what we do, and specifically what I do. Is CPAD and CD related work, and 30 by 30 now. So as I said, or I don't know if I said, but we're a small team. We have 14 people plus the founder, who is Larry Orman, who has retired but is still around. And our team is divided essentially, I would say half, we can all do GIS, but half of our team focuses on like the interactive web side of things, and the other half is essentially more kind of like either cartography or, like in my case, more data automation and kind of the more hard like GIS stuff. So some of the projects that we have done, I guess I was trying to come up with categories that I could put our projects in, because, going through every single project would take a long time. So I was trying to highlight projects that we've done and kind of put them in certain categories. So I would say that one of the major categories for our projects is helping guide public funding decisions or helping strengthen democratic institutions. These types of projects tend to be very public facing. They have websites, they have web tools, can be used by anyone in the public, and these tend to be medium to large projects. Then we also have GIS projects, which tend to be like smaller, client only facing. And then finally, we have projects that fall into the mapping the public landscape sort of category, which is essentially 3 different databases that we have created and put out into the world. And so these are very large, ongoing, very public things that we have, that we keep on working on over time. Oh, there's Nate. Okay. Hi, Nate. So to start with, let's look at some of the projects that help guide public funding decisions. So we have the Conservation Lands Network Explorer version 1, 2, and now we're working on version 3. This is a project that began 10 years ago that we've been sort of working on. over time. It's specifically, I mean, anyone can log in and use the Conservation Lands Network Explorer, but it's designed for participants in biodiversity issues and planning. Essentially, it allows any user to draw a custom area, and then within that custom area, it pulls a bunch of relevant information. For that area, it creates online charts and summaries and reports that can then be used as sort of evidence to guide regional conservation funding and habitat protection. And so I can show you the website for this. So this is it's on bayarealands.org, and the client for this is Together Bay Area. And yeah, it's I guess let me zoom out. This is for the Bay Area only. I think it's 10 counties around the Bay Area. This is done for, and essentially you can, as I said, I'm actually not logged in, so I can't. I haven't created an account and logged in, but if you do, you could, as I said, draw an area, and then it will kind of look like this. It will pull together some statistics and some data for you that you could then go ahead to use as a conservation biologist or whoever you are. So another project that falls in this category is Parks for California. The client is the California Department of Parks and Recreation. And essentially this was done because the Department for Parks and Recreation wanted a better way to allocate their funding. They wanted to allocate their funding more equitably. So they were looking to, for a tool that would allow them to, better target park poor communities and low income communities. And so we created this website that, let me pull it up. That, when you come to this website, there are a number of tools here actually that allow you. There's the statewide parks program, community fact finder, the outdoor equity program, community fact finder, the per capita income tool, and the park access tool. So if we click on, for example, the park access tool, and if we type in Yolo County, it will tell you things like, what % of Yolo County residents live further than a half mile from a park, what % of residents live within an area with less than 3 acres of parks. And you could, find, essentially, it allows you to find places or see if certain places are more park poor than others. There's also, as part of this tool, as part of this website, the other tool on here allows you to add an address, and it will pull up all of the population statistics for that area, but you could also see if there's any parks within a half-mile radius of where you live. So, and lastly, you can also find where funds have been allocated and how much funds have been allocated to certain areas. So the state parks, I guess, has been finding this as a useful tool to track, to track where their money is going and how they're allocating it. So the other category that I had mentioned is projects that help strengthen democratic institutions. And this category essentially has a number of projects that have something to do with, the political side of things in the country. There's a website that we created called All About Redistricting, or we didn't create, the website already existed, but we redeveloped it. The client is the Loyola Law School. The website has an unrivaled depth of information about legal cases, laws, and the processes of redistricting. And yeah, we did a full site redesign build, and I think the client has been very happy about it. So, another example of project that is strengthening democratic institutions is the University of Florida Election Lab. They have the most important and widely used election-related data in the United States. It's being used by journalists and researchers, etc. So what we did for them is we created a data archive that makes it much, I guess, compared to what they had before, it made it a lot easier, much more easy. It made it easier to find information that people might be looking for when it comes to election turnouts and things like that. And another project that falls in this category is optimizing voter center turnout placements. So the Center for Inclusive Democracy, which I think is at Stanford, I want to say Stanford, they created a tool that helps visualize sort of optimum voter center placement. And they did this for 5 counties within California. And they hired us to work with them to essentially expand that analysis and to cover more than 400 counties, or nearly 400 counties across 10 states, which was, quite a big chunk of the US population. So that was, I think, a really cool project as well. And then we have also measuring gerrymandering with PlanScore. So PlanScore is a team of lawyers, academics, and open source developers, and they came together to create a pretty amazing data set. I think the most extensive data set about partisan gerrymandering in the United States. And what we did is we worked with them to rapidly develop a website that can showcase all that data that they had gathered. And the cool thing about this website is if you go on it, and it allows you, if you're a policymaker or journalist or whatever, or just a regular person, you can freely test any new plans for gerrymandering. So that's pretty cool. So that sort of, so those 2 categories, as I said, they're very public facing, very, they're essentially projects that have websites and can be used by the wide public. But we also do a lot of sort of what I would call GIS only projects, where we don't end up having any of that work end up in a public facing space. So it tends to be more just used internally by our clients. And, one of the things that we have done, and I would say that we're getting quite good at, and people keep coming to us for, is parcel prioritization and clustering. So a couple of the nonprofits that we've worked with are the Nature Conservancy and Peninsula Open Space Trust. I don't know if, I'm sure everyone's heard of the Nature Conservancy, but the Peninsula Open Space Trust is on the peninsula. So if you've ever heard of them. And essentially it's, for these organizations, they are trying to conserve lands and essentially find new places to conserve. And what we've done for them is essentially create a tool that can help them that they can use internally, that can help them find owners of many or large parcels that are in proximity that also match certain conservation criteria. And so it essentially allows them to, instead of having to click on every parcel and figure out where they might want to conserve land, it's a tool that allows them to prioritize looking at certain areas over other areas. Which helps them, be more efficient in reaching out and getting in touch with landowners who might be interested in conserving their land. So another project that we're working on right now, actually 2 of my coworkers are pretty deep in this, is with the Fish in the Fields program with the Resource Renewal Institute. They're out, I want to say, gosh, I don't know, maybe Yuba? I'm not sure. They're somewhere out there. So their Fish in the Fields program puts this is such a cool program. They put young trout and salmon in flooded rice paddies, because flooded rice paddies have a lot of phytoplankton, and so young trout and salmon can eat that phytoplankton and grow to be bigger and stronger, which is good for them before they enter the river. So this has been a very successful program when it comes to kind of helping the survival rate for young trout and salmon. And what we've been doing for them is to help them identify new areas within the valley that they can expand their Fish in the Fields program into. So pretty cool. And another project that is pretty much only GIS facing so far is the tree canopy cover on schoolyards. So we're working with a plan called Green Schoolyards America, and they're striving to increase tree canopy on school grounds because that tends to benefit students. And we're working with them to the California branch of this organization to essentially assess the percent of tree canopy cover for all K through 12 schools within California. And yeah. So moving on to the sort of last category that I mentioned, which is mapping the public landscape. So the project that I just mentioned, one of the reasons that it's possible is because we have what is called the California School Campus Database, and we created this database. We developed it from the year 2012 to 2016. It's essentially an inventory of all K through 12 public schools in California, and we release updates to this database as there's funding. You know, whenever we get funding to go in and update it, we release updates. But it's not, I guess what I'm trying to say is there's no consistent schedule for when we release updates to this database, but it exists. If you go to, I think it's California School Campus Database I want to say it's .org, but yeah, you can download it, and it's got it all the schools in California, K through 12. But I would say that the database that we work on the most is CPAD, so the California Protected Areas Database. And so you guys said that you've used it.
Yeah.
What have you used it for? I'm curious.
I have worked with it, doing, with like Marksan analysis, looking at prioritizing, deciding, conservation areas potentially for various state agencies.
Okay.
Also, I used to work at state parks, so like that was important for that.
Yeah.
Various things.
I've used this one too. I just forgot the acronym was for consulting for like impacts, like I did one for Delta Canal, and I wanted to see all the park protected areas. That was
like an environmental impact report kind of a thing.
Well, yes. Related to that.
Related.
Yes, that's
okay. Environmental impacts. Yeah. Awesome. Okay. That's so great. Yes. So CPAD. So what is CPAD? Well, I guess you guys have used it, but for those of you that haven't used it, essentially, if you imagine the state of California being a patchwork of lands that is owned by different entities, different agencies, organizations, and managed by different agencies, organizations, etc. CPAD looks at, CPAD is essentially a collection of all the lands that are owned by public agencies, that it's public agencies in some ways, so it's publicly owned lands in some way or another, and specifically lands that are open space lands. So open space, publicly owned lands is what ends up in CPAD. And we began collecting data for CPAD 20 years ago. So this is a very mature database. We have probably at this point inventoried what is likely around 99, probably more % of all of these lands in California. It's at around 49.8 million acres that we've inventoried over the last 20 years. And the number of agencies that are represented within CPAD in terms of agencies that own and or manage those lands. It's over 1,500 agencies. We update this database twice a year. Usually in June and December, we'll release an update. And you can download it from calands.org. So what counts as essentially protected lands, or what makes it in this database? Well, we have, this actually, I want you guys to remember what I say for this slide. I mean, I know you're paying attention, but I really want people to pay attention to this particular slide because it's gonna come up. It's actually very important for what we'll discuss later. But what ends up in CPAD is, as I said, any space that is open space and publicly owned. So it's, you know, city and neighborhood parks, regional parks, watersheds, flood management areas, ecological preserves, state national parks, national forest, BLM lands, even like farmlands and ranch lands that are public or protected in some way for the public. So as you can see, it's a very wide slew of, you know, types of lands that end up in CPAD, in CPAD. Which the reason why that's important is because even though these are all lands that are public, they're managed very differently. They're managed for very different purposes. So your city park is going to be managed for recreation. It's going to be managed for, you know, the people that use the park. That's very different from how, say, Yosemite National Park is managed, or how an ecological preserve is managed. So those are managed much more for biodiversity and for species preservation and conservation and things like that. And that's an important distinction to make, that that lands that we have in CPAD are managed very differently. And how those lands are managed is actually what ends up distinguishing which will make it into 30 by 30 later, and we'll talk about that. But the other database that we work on is called the California Conservation Easement Database, and it's another GIS data set that focuses on, you know, we have permanent conservation easements essentially in that data set. We've inventoried 2.4 million acres. And we also update it together with CPAD twice a year, and it's also on calands.org. Now, we just discussed some of the uses that you guys have, you know, used CPAD, and I don't know if any of you have used CCD, but so yeah, environmental impacts reports, or looking at environmental impacts, or researching that kind of thing is one of the uses. But I would say that CPADs and CCD are, I think, very widely used in any type of planning. So if you're doing county planning, city planning, if you're looking at emergency planning, if you're looking at even like climate adaptation, things like that. You know, recreation access is actually a big one, as we saw. With Parks for California, recreation access is very important, and it's actually one within this tool that I showed you earlier. We use CPAD to be able to determine if people have access to parks within a half-mile radius of them. So I kind of want to take a little break right now, because I think it's a good time to stop and give us some time to ask questions. If anyone has any questions about GreenInfo, any of the projects that I showed, any questions related to GreenInfo so far. And I don't know if anyone on the chat wants to ask questions.
So you mentioned, as you were talking, that people find you. How do you connect with partners, and big and small, for both your internal and external sort of?
How do we like find clients?
Yeah, how do you make those connections? What do you?
You know, at this point, I think because we've done so much work, I think people just come to us at this point.
Yeah.
But I think, I mean, when Larry Orman, who's the founder of GreenInfo, I think when he was the executive director, now it's Dan Rademacher. when I think Larry was there, and this was, more before he was he was executive director until 2015, I think. So the online side of things wasn't as developed, I would say, by that point. So I think it was just a lot of networking, going to events, going to meeting with partners, essentially, or going to events where people that we might be interested in our work would be, and just, having a showcase of some of the work that we've done. But it's also been a lot of word of mouth, and yeah, I think that's kind of how things got started. And I think at this point, we also, I suppose, do a lot of we do search for RFPs, like requests for proposals. So even though a lot of people do come to us, I think there's also I would say a third of our work is perhaps from people just looking, and that's people that I work with that say, what, I'm really curious about us working on this project, or us working with this particular organization. Like, let's see if they have something that we could potentially submit a what is a statement of work for. So yeah. It's I think it's a mixed bag.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because, and thank you for sharing all the different kinds of things you do. That was interesting. You've got everything from national gerrymandering issues to like very local park access. Like, it would seem different, right? That's a really interesting mix of different sort of applications.
Yeah, and I would say that is a big part of that comes from, we have a team of 14 people, and I think we have varied interests within our team and varied skill sets. So that's probably a big part of why we're able to do such varied projects. And I would say that it's such a, luxury in many ways to be working on a team with that many GIS people. I definitely don't take that for granted. I know a lot of people are much more solo when it comes to working on GIS type things, and working on a team of other GIS experts is quite awesome. Because it's a lot of what we can create as a team is, I think, pretty awesome compared to what you could create working solo. It's just, all those other skill sets that people have developed can come in and really make a project blossom. So yeah,
that's literally why we started Map Time Davis, was to get all of the solo people scattered all over campus have a home, to bring people together, because like we are the only people in our labs thing. So
yeah. Have any of you tried to, I guess, collaborate on a project with each other on anything, or?
We did try at one point to do like a group project, but given the nature of academic work, it did not end up being useful for anybody involved. So that is challenging, but just having the support of other people and knowing, like,
for sure,
making connections is huge in this kind of environment where we all tend to be very scattered. So it does sound like a dream to work with a lot of other GIS people, kind of like how I used to be.
Yeah, no, it's true.
I think that I find it such a shame that GIS folks tend to be so scattered and independent and pulled apart. And I mean, I understand why it is, but it really, I think that having someone else to talk to is just so, it can get you much further along in your work when you have another brain to, to talk about your ideas with. So
yeah, no, that sounds like an organization where you have a potential. It's one thing to have all the brains together, and then to have all these terrific projects, which is why it's great that some of it comes from the interest generated within the group of where you'd like to go.
Right. Yeah. No, people are definitely given the freedom at work to, if there is a project that they're interested in working on, for us to apply to that project, if there's an RFP out for it. So and people have done that and gotten it, and it just, you know, it just all comes down to, do we have the skill sets to be able to essentially compete for that project with other organizations that might be, you know, because even though, you know, we're not tiny, but there are organizations out there that are much bigger and, you know, better probably in some ways in terms of what they can offer. But I would say, yeah, I'd say that what we have is fairly competitive. It's just sometimes more difficult to compete with the bigger organizations out there. Okay, so do you think we're ready to move on? Any other questions?
Yeah, I'm not seeing any in the chat, so, but, you know, folks can post stuff as they think of it.
Okay. So let's see. There we go. Yeah, okay. So 30 by 30. The reason why I wanted to spend some time telling you guys about CPAD and CCD is because they are the foundational data sets for 30 by 30. And I guess, well, I was gonna ask before I jump to that slide, I guess I was gonna ask, do you guys know what 30 by 30 is? Okay, none of you?
A little, yeah.
Some of you do.
I imagine some of our folks online maybe.
Okay.
Although I bet Nate knows.
Yeah, well.
Yeah, I've heard of it somewhere along the way.
Yeah, I'd imagine so, Nate. So 30 by 30 is an effort that strives to conserve 30% of California's lands and coastal waters by 2030. And can you guess what percent we are at now? So if we want to conserve 30% by 2030, do you know what percentage we're at now?
I would guess 18.
I was gonna say 10.
I'm gonna say 10, 18, 10, 15, 5%. Okay. Well, thankfully we're higher than all. I'll tell you later when it is. We are higher than all of those, but you have to wait for that. So anyhow, 30 by 30 was first proposed as a concept in 2019. I could be wrong, and I don't know if Nate knows more about this, but I think it was first proposed in Europe, somewhere in Europe as a concept. You know, California being, you know, we tend to jump on these things, on these sorts of, you know, efforts before other people do. So in 2020, not surprisingly, Governor Newsom signed his nature-based solutions executive order N8220, and as part of the executive order, we committed, the state of California committed to the goal of conserving 30% of our lands and coastal waters by 2030. Now, since 2020, and since California jumped on this, other states in the US decided to commit to 30 by 30 as well. And just last December in 2022, there was the Kunming-Montreal agreement that 190 countries decided to sign. So, and 30 by 30 is a major goal of the Kunming-Montreal agreement. And I would say essentially at this point that the whole world has committed to conserving 30% of land and coastal waters by the year 2030. Which is a big commitment and a very important one. So we had another big win, just October of this year. 30 by 30 has been made official by Senate Bill 337, which was signed by the governor. So it is now no longer just an executive order, which is great. And I believe it passed without any, with all yeses in the Senate. So that's such a big win. I could be wrong on that though, but anyhow, so the reason why I'm talking to you about 30 by 30 today is because I think it's a very important problem to solve. I think it's at its heart, I think it's a geospatial problem. And it's happening right now with major consequences for the future of biodiversity conservation. And in some ways, I'm using today's presentation to highlight how, you know, it seems like it shouldn't be too hard to do 30 by 30, but I'm going to show you some of the complexities that have arisen and sort of what we have done at GreenInfo to address them. So I guess I would say that in many ways, we're still in the initial stages of 30 by 30 legislation. We can check that off, that's been done. The next stage after legislation is obviously to choose a system that determines which lands can count as conserved for 30 by 30. So, you know, if you have all these lands, you have to figure out, okay, well, which of these lands can actually count toward the 30% conserved and which ones will not be counted. So what kind of criteria are you going to put in place to decide to have some sort of a decision, you know, decision-making process that will allow you to decide what goes toward 30%. So this system is called the USGS Gap Status Code System, and it was chosen by CNRA, who we are working with on this. You know, Nate is representing them right now. So CNRA, the California Natural Resources Agency, decided to use the gap code status system essentially to distinguish between lands that would make it toward the 30% and those that will not. And then where we come in is essentially the part where, now that we have the system, we have to assign that system. We have to take that gap code system and assign it to the lands in California and map those that qualify as conserved for 30 by 30. And that's where GreenInfo's work is coming in. So remember how I asked you what percent we're at? So I don't know if you can tell, but 24.4%. Better than, what was it, 5, 10, 18, 10, yeah. So, and essentially this is, in some ways, the final product that we want to be able to, well, that we have gotten to, but I'm gonna show you today how we've gotten to here. So these are, if you go to californianature.ca.gov, and if you open the Conserved Areas Explorer, you will see essentially all the lands that currently count toward that 30% target. And there's a nice dashboard, and there's actually a lot of different tools there that allow you to explore a lot of this data. So I do encourage you all to go to that website as well. But what the rest of this presentation is going to be about is how we've been able to get to this point. So how do we get from having, you know, the GIS data that is CPAD and CCD to having this data? You might think that it would be as easy as saying, okay, all the lands in CPAD plus all the lands in CCD just end up counting toward 30 by 30, but that's not true because of what I had brought up earlier, in that these lands that are in CPAD and CCD are actually managed very differently. Your city park is not going to be managed for, you know, rare species. It's not going to be managed for biodiversity. It's going to be managed for recreation, and that really matters. And so what are the criteria that get lands to qualify for 30 by 30? Well, they have to have permanent protection from conversion to a natural state. They have to be conserved for biodiversity, where unnatural disturbances such as like logging or mining or, you know, ATV vehicles, etc., are minimized if not present at all. Hiking is allowed and some other uses are allowed, you know, but I don't want to dive into the complexity of that too much in this presentation. That's a whole other beast. But essentially they have to be conserved for biodiversity and not for recreation. And they have to have an active, legally enforceable management plan that maintains a natural state. So essentially, these three criteria, the permanent protection, conserve for biodiversity, and an active legally enforceable management plan, is what allows for the creation of a strong foundation of like a network of lands that have a strong foundation for future conservation and stewardship work. You know, you don't want to be, you don't really want to take your neighborhood park or city park to count toward this, because conserving it for biodiversity is just not going to happen. So you need lands that meet these requirements in order to be able to really conserve for biodiversity and protect these lands for future conservation work. So as I said, the system that is being used is called the USGS GAP codes. The system was created in the 1990s. So it's been around for a while, and it's been used for federal lands specifically for a while, to rank biodiversity protection and conservation status on federal lands specifically. It's now being adopted to be used on state lands and local lands, which is providing some, complexity. There's some complexity there, but essentially it's the system that, it's pretty much the only system that is available at the moment. So that's what we're using. Nobody has come up with anything better. So this is what we're using to apply to all the lands, regardless of whether they're federal or state or local lands. And if you want to learn more about GAP status or the GAP analysis projects, I think you can just look up GAP analysis, and anything related to USGS is what you can read about. So there are 4 different GAP status codes from 1 to 4. Essentially, lands that meet the requirements specified in GAP status 1 are lands that are essentially the most protected. They offer the highest level of conservation and protection for biodiversity. And lands that would qualify as GAP status 4 would have pretty much no or the least amount of protection and conservation for biodiversity. So an example would be Central Park in Davis is going to be a GAP status 4. And something like Yosemite is going to be a GAP status 1. So just so you can kind of, an ecological preserve is probably most likely going to be a GAP status 1, maybe a 2, depending on what kind of activity is allowed on it. But yeah, so that's something to think about in terms of where things fall. So where are we at now? Well, now the next logical step is, okay, we want to apply GAP status codes to CPAD and CD and essentially grab everything that is GAP 1, GAP 2 in both databases, and that equals 30 by 30. And that seems like, how hard could that be? We just need to assign the GAP codes, right? I mean, it shouldn't be a hard thing, right? So
Honestly, it really doesn't sound like it should be hard. So
it honestly doesn't seem like it should be hard at all, right?
Select a pen, right?
Yeah, right. No. So the problem that we have run into is that we essentially have insufficient data. So again, there's 49 million acres of protected lands in CPAD. Now, the majority of those lands are federal and state-owned lands, which thankfully we do have GAP code data for. Like we do have, so the federal lands, for a while there has been GAP status assigned to them, and there's a database called PAD US, which I don't know if you've ever used, but we essentially use that database to grab GAP status codes for federal lands. For state-owned lands, we have the California Department of Parks and Recreation has provided gap codes for their lands. So as I said, the majority, we have gap codes for them, and that's not the hard part of this problem. The hard part of this problem is that not an insignificant minority, and I would say a growing part of at least the rest of, we're at 24%, those other 6%, a lot of those 6% are going to come from agencies that are local agencies, so nonprofits, land trusts, things like that. We don't have gap code data for those lands. So there's a lot of land out there that we don't have gap code data on, and that's essentially the heart of what we have been doing at GreenInfo for the last 11 months, is coming up with a way, which we've come up with a way to get that data. And so we need those local and managing agencies essentially to learn about gap codes, and then to assign gap codes to their lands, and then provide us with that data. So we decided, and so let's take a moment to acknowledge that there's a lot of those agencies and organizations out there. They don't know what gap codes are. So we're asking them to learn about gap codes. We're asking them to assign the correct gap code to their lands. And then we're asking them to contribute that gap code data back to us. And it's important. It's important that, we think it's important that they try to, do this process and to contribute this data. And so we took the time to create what is called the 30 by 30 toolkit, which is trying to make this process as smooth and easy as possible for these agencies, which it's still hard. It's still hard for them, but hopefully it's a little bit easier with this toolkit than it would have been if they were completely on their own. So talking about the toolkit essentially has two components. So this lives on calands.org/30 by 30 toolkit. And there are essentially two components to this toolkit. An agency can come here and first there's the website component, which is essentially a big tutorial on what to do, how to do it. It's a guide. And then the second component is a data package. If you come down here and you click 30 by 30 toolkit, you can search for your agency, organization, or whatever. So you can type in YOLO County or YOLO anything, if you're the YOLO Land Trust, and you can click on the zip file, and essentially this zip file is, I've actually pulled it up here. It's a set of files that is specific to that agency's lands in CPAD and CCD. So they can't see anybody else's lands, just their lands in CPAD and CCD, and which helps them focus on just their part. And then we provide them with, essentially some agencies have GIS capability and some agencies don't. And so maybe they have just Excel capability. So we wanted to provide them both with shapefiles and with Excel tables. So the data is split into Excel files. It's the same data, it's just that it's in both a shapefile and Excel format. And what it looks like is just, so this is YOLO Land Trust, and this is the shapefile for their lands in CCD. They also have another shapefile for their lands in CPAD, which this is the county of YOLO, but we can see what that looks like too. But essentially, it's just it's a much trimmed down version in terms of the attributes. They can only see some of the attributes, but the most important ones from CCD, which is the unique ID for each geometry. They can see the site name, the fact that they are the easement holder, and the public access, the year that it was established, the acres, and then we allow them to assign a gap code to that particular piece of land. So the idea is that they can use these shapefiles, or if they don't have shapefile capability, they can also open up the Excel file, which has this data, but in a one moment. They can use this these files, whether it's the shapefiles or the Excel files, to make they can make revisions, because it's important to revise their data before we actually assign gap codes. So they can first make revisions and submit those revisions back to us, and they can obviously assign gap codes and submit that data as well. Now, the agencies that don't have GIS capability, they can actually still see the shape of their, the geometry that is associated with the data in CPAD or CCD. We take them to a platform that we created called Map Collaborator, where we host CPAD and CD, and they can see it, the particular shape associated with that record, and they can say, okay, this needs to get fixed or whatever. And so let me get back to the presentation, which is here. Sorry, where did it go? There it is. Yeah. So, oh, and I forgot to tell you that for agencies that don't have, sorry, I'm kind of all over the place here, but for agencies that don't have either GIS capability or Excel capability, which there are some land trusts out there that just don't, it's like they have very minimal funding, but they have lands, and it's like, well, we want you to still submit data on your lands, or assign gap codes, etc. So what I actually used GeoPandas to create a script that loops through the data that we have in CPAD and outputs for each of their lands in CPAD. It creates a map. And so
That's awesome.
it's the coolest thing, because I don't want to do this by hand. I don't want to go through 50 different shapes and create a map for each, and etc. So essentially, for each record that is in CPAD and CCD, it will loop through and it creates a map, and it shows the parcels, which are in yellow, and then it shows the. So CPAD, I haven't discussed this, but CPAD actually comes in 3 different spatial levels, I would say. We have it, so we publish it in what we call the super unit level, which is essentially the, essentially the outline of your park, right? The major outline of your park. If you think about Yosemite Park, it's got its main shape. And then we publish down the next level down, we publish it what we call the unit level, which splits it down across county lines. And then we publish down at another level, which is called the holding level, which is, it publishes all the individual parcels that are within, your park. So, which are what the white lines here. So the blue line here is at the super unit level, and then the white line is at the holding level. So,
May I ask?
sure, go ahead.
So, I love that I'm seeing this in paint, because that's the reality of the situation.
Yeah.
You're all the way down to
For
no
sure.
Excel, right? So,
Yeah.
does this trigger some sort of outreach to the owner if you get a reply in Excel that says, I need to change my boundary, or if you get a scribble on a, not scribble, but if they draw by hand on a map like that, do you then outreach with the owner to confirm the details, or?
Right, yeah, no, absolutely. We the reason we made these maps is so that we could, if they need us to even mail them to them, they want to scribble on a piece, scribble on a printout of the map and then send it back to us, whatever it is. We absolutely are willing to take data in any format, right? Even if it's written, even if they draw here on paint. The idea is that we just provide them with any possible way of submitting data back.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, we are happy to.
And then do you follow up or do you
Yeah.
take whatever is?
Oh, yeah, I mean, we probably, you know, like get on a phone call with them and discuss what, if we're understanding their input correctly. I mean, it doesn't really matter who we're talking with and what, like, even if it's with people who have GIS capability, we actually have email exchanges that are like, you know, can I just confirm that this is exactly what you want to be doing? And so, yeah, we tend to be fairly thorough, because there are situations where it's like, I'm not certain they meant it this way or this way. You know, how do I input this data? Anytime that there is any sort of, you know, lack of clarity, we absolutely reach out, because we don't want to assume on their part what they meant. So, yeah. And yeah. And I mean, and that's definitely like less of a case for data submitted by, you know, with a shapefile. But even then, there are times when I'm like, I'm not sure this makes sense. So anyhow, yeah, this, I actually wanted to show you. So this is actually for the California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection, which of course they have a GIS. They have GIS capabilities, but we just did this as a, you know, way to show that we can loop through, you know, any agency that has a ton of essentially parks or properties. So this was really fun for me, I have to say, and I highly encourage anyone that has to create, you know, that has to manually recreate something over and over again, whether it's a map or really anything else. I have found GeoPandas to be really useful in scenarios like that. So going back to, actually, I want to go back to the website, because I wanted to show you, and trying to find the website here, which I'm having a difficult time, but oh no, that's not. So going back to the website, once agencies have the toolkit up and open, they can actually come through here, and we have sections of the website that tells them how to review and revise their lands. So it provides them with, you know, how to work with your shapefiles, how to work with your tables, how do you submit edits using Map Collaborator or PDF maps, you know, how do you return your data? And then we also have information on, once you start assigning gap codes, we have, you know, an overview of the gap codes definitions, some examples of what falls under each gap code status. And then we have a way for them to, you know, there's this decision tree that helps them determine where each of their properties could fall when it comes to gap codes. And how to assign them then to, how to assign the gap codes in their shapefiles or tables, which again, I'm not gonna dive into this for this presentation, but it's not as simple as, because we allow percentages. So, and I'm not gonna dive into that, but we do allow, we essentially allow a property to be, you know, you can say 40% of it is gap 1 and you know, 30% of it is gap 3 and whatever. So we do allow for that. Even, yeah. So anyhow, going back to the presentation. So this toolkit, which again, we're using to get data from those local and regional agencies that need to provide us with gap status codes for their local and regional lands that are not at the state and federal level that we already have data for. So this toolkit is essentially made possible by the use of pandas and GeoPandas. You know, pandas is a Python library that is used for data manipulation, and so we need to do a lot of that here. And then GeoPandas is used for, another Python library is used for spatial analysis and geoprocessing. So there's a lot of that going on here too. And so the reason why I chose this is one, I actually used pandas and geopandas for my master's thesis, and I just absolutely loved working with them. And I was already so, like, my mind was just working in that space already, and so I just decided to. And I love that it's open space. I love that essentially, you know, even if, you know, I have this sort of dream in my head that maybe, you know, this is now a worldwide effort. And I'm like, well, there are people all around the world that might want to actually take on some of this, you know, some of this work and to apply it to their 30 by 30. And the fact that it's with open source software means that it doesn't matter where you live, you could do this. You don't have to have Esri, you don't have to have, you know, proprietary tools. So to me, that was important. And I don't know if we'll get there. I don't know if we'll get to the part where we could share our scripts, and whether sharing our scripts would be useful, I don't know. But anyhow, I also am definitely using pandas and geopandas because we have to do this twice a year, and I just don't want to do it manually. And it would take a lot longer to do it manually than to run some scripts in the background and just walk away. And well, of course, there's a lot of QA QC, because you want to make sure that your scripts are doing what they're supposed to be doing, but it's definitely faster and easier than doing it manually. And not only faster and easier, but obviously when you have a process that's automated, you take away human error in the sense that, well, there's human error in creating the scripts, but other types of, you know, you can mistype and etc. So anyhow, so I wanted to just quickly walk through the steps of what the scripts do, and in general, how the tool package, how it's made to work. So the first step was to create the data package, or the data tool package for each agency. And again, this is using pandas, geopandas. So for each agency in our agency table, the script takes the agency's name, and then it selects all the lands in CPAT and CD in that for that agency. And then it exports those lands into both the shapefile, and the attributes are exported into a pre-formatted Excel table, which is what I showed you. And then we also have a part of the script that can make those, well, PNGs or PDF maps, whatever it is that we choose for those lands. And so once we have created the toolkit package, well, there's a step that's missing here, but it sort of implies that we also have another step that uploads all of that onto an Amazon Web Service platform, that so that people can download it online. And then the second step is that we need to digest, now that the toolkits are out there and people are using them, when they start returning them, we need to be able to digest that data. Now, a lot of that data has to be digested manually, so we need to manually review whatever has been returned in terms of any changes to the name. Essentially, a lot of the attribute changes we have to review manually to make sure there's no like misspellings, or that it makes sense. You know, we don't want to be putting in data that is, you know, we want to be making sure that we're inputting data that makes sense. And so there is manual review. So anytime that attributes are updated and geometry is updated, and also anytime that there are deletions or additions, additions or deletions to CPAT or CD data, we have to do that manually. So, and that can be a time-consuming step, but it's a necessary step, and it's a part of what we would do normally whenever because we normally ask agencies to submit data, you know, if they've updated any of their lands, we need to update CPAT and CD with that new data anyway. So this is, I would say that this is a part of our normal editing routine for CPAT and CD. Then the part that is new, essentially at this point, is the digestion of gap code data. So thankfully we can automate this part, because it's, I mean, we have some QA QC around it, but thankfully, we can just, you know, upload and intake all of those gap codes, create, you know, have a script that runs through and essentially compiles one big table with the unique IDs and then the associated gap code for that ID. I don't know if you guys want to see any, I mean, I can't really run the scripts right now, but if you wanted to just see them, I don't know, is that interesting? They're just scripts, but I guess I can just quickly show. Yeah, so this was the first script. You know, the first script where lands are essentially selected out of CPAD and CD for each agency. And again, using pandas and geopandas. This is not the longest script, believe it or not, but the majority of this script actually goes into the creation of those PDF maps. So that's the majority of the script. Then we have the script that pushes it all onto AWS. And then we have the script that takes those returned packages, return toolkits, and creates a gap code, essentially one giant gap code table. And this one is not too bad. The next one, though, which I'll talk about next, is the most giantest script of all, with over 1,000 lines. But okay, give me a second. There we go. So the next step in this process is, so once we have that giant table essentially of gap code input from local agencies, we then have now the final piece. So we have gap code data from our federal lands, which is from PAD US data. We have gap code data from for our state lands, which is from the California Department of Parks and Recreation. And now we finally have, from those returned toolkits, we have our final piece, which is gap code data for local and regional lands by local and regional agencies. And the way that we do this is that we say, okay, if you have a piece of land and we happen to have essentially overlapping input for that piece of land, maybe the PAD US data set says that needs to be a gap 4 or a gap 3, whatever. But then we have a local agency saying, oh, no, this is actually gap 1 or whatever it is. We have local agency input trumping state input, and state input trumps federal input. So, or national input, and obviously local input also trumps federal input. So we really do care about local input. Local input essentially is the most accurate, is the way we see it, because they are the agencies that know their lands best, and we're going to trust, you know, what they say over what some other data set that might have, you know, it's at a national level, and it's like at the local level, it's not going to be very accurate. So that is that part of the logic behind assigning gap codes. And as I showed you the script, it's a big long script. There's a lot of geoprocessing. This is sort of the flow chart or flow diagram for all the logic that goes into assigning gap codes to lands in CPAD and CD. It's not terrible, but it is a lot of steps. And we have QA QC built into the script, thankfully. So we only have to look at the output of everything and make sure that everything looks right. So the process is essentially, this part of the process is entirely automated, and we just need to look at the QA QC outputs and make sure it matches with what we wanted to match. So the final step to this piece is, at this point, gap codes have been assigned to CPAD and CD. The final step of this process is calculating the final qualifying 30 by 30 acreage. I mean, we obviously can now take what is in CPAD and CD, and we can take everything that's gap code 1 and 2 and create that 30 by 30 map, right, that we saw. But then the other part of this is the other complexity within this problem is that CPAD and CCD sometimes overlap. And because sometimes you can have a conservation easement on top of public land, right? So you can, and so if you have one agency that has submitted a particular gap code for that conservation easement and another agency that has submitted a different gap code for that same piece of land, and sometimes they don't overlap perfectly, but partially. And so we have a script that actually uses 3 different mathematical models to look at, it essentially looks at all the lands. First, it calculates acreage for all the lands that are not overlapping, which is very easy, very fast, quick, right? Simple. And then it looks at all the different scenarios for all the overlapping lands, because we are not in a position to say which of those gap codes is correct. We can't know. We can't, we don't have, we're not on the ground.
Right.
So we have essentially the models tell us, okay, if this is correct, then this is the number that we can add to this to the non-overlapping lands, or if this other scenario is correct, then we can add this other number to. So essentially we create a final number that has a margin of error, so to say, for what that final acreage is. And I would say that while this was difficult to figure out, because it certainly wasn't geospatially, it wasn't easy, like the geospatial processing for this was not straightforward. And I created a whole document for all the logic behind it, but it was really fun to figure it out. So, so anyhow, as I said, the final product after all of this is the creation of this, data that can be viewed on californianature.ca.gov, which, the more we add to this, essentially the more accurate it becomes. And from here on, we have about 5.6% or about 6 million acres to go to reach that 30% target. So what needs to happen is that we need more of these local agencies to submit gap code data to us, because right now, some have submitted, but not everyone has submitted. There's a lot more agencies out there that have not submitted gap code data. And the other part, obviously, is that we need strategic new land conservation by local and state agencies, and that's where this map becomes so useful, is because they can strategically conserve by connecting pieces, by choosing places that really need to be that have high conservation value, etc. So yeah, I guess this is sort of the end of what I really have, but I have some food for thought at this point, which is some of the things that I've been thinking about, which are that 30 by 30 at the state level doesn't imply 30 by 30 at the county or regional level. And currently, we have areas like the San Francisco Bay Area is actually already at 30 by 30, surprisingly. But now they're thinking 50 by 50, which would be cool. But what about other counties and other regions within California, some of which are, I'm not even sure if they're at like 5%, right? So there are going to be areas within California, and I'm not in a position to say how important it is for those areas to meet a 30 by 30 goal, but especially thinking about it from a, just an equity perspective, I personally think it might be important to at least inch them closer to something, so they're not at 0 or 5 or whatever that is much lower than, say, the SF area. And some other food for thought, more food for thought is, I told you guys that essentially at this point, all these other states have taken on 30 by 30. It's actually also being taken on at the national level. I think President Biden signed an executive order in 2021. So there is, I think it's called America the Beautiful, which is, I'm not sure if the website is up, but that's going to be I think that's where the national 30 by 30 is going to be showcased. But we also have all these countries around the world, and from what I have seen so far, which I'm certainly not an expert, certainly not at a national or worldwide level, but out of everyone that I have sort of tried to research, is that California appears to be the only one with any significant 30 by 30 data so far, or really any. I have yet to see any other state or country present any 30 by 30 data. And can any of you think about why that might be?
It seems like we have a good starting point with the
Yeah.
data sets. It's like,
Yeah,
obviously, like CPAP's been around for a long time,
Yes.
so
yes,
I feel like if you had to start with making your own CPAP for your
Yeah.
state, it would take a very long time.
that's right.
Because it started at the baseline that we were starting with as a state.
Yes, yeah, so I would say that's probably the major drawback for a lot of other states right now, is that I think a lot of them are scrambling to put together some sort of starting data set. Some of them actually have, are pretty far along. I think it was in Virginia, I forget which state it was that, it's pretty far along, almost as far as we are, but. And you know, some of those states are fairly small, and I think they could probably put together a data set fairly quickly. Like California is huge, so it makes sense that it's taken us so long to gather so many of our lands in one place, but so I think that is a major drawback, but I think, you know, the United States is a fairly well-funded country, but I think about, you know, other countries around the world and how this might be such a big challenge for them. And I don't know how any of them are approaching gathering data. It's just something that I'm curious about. You know, as I do my work, I'm so curious to see how this effort might happen in other places around the world and what their challenges might be. But as I was saying earlier, I feel like once people have a data set that they can base their work on, I'm hoping that we could, at the very least, provide some of our logic behind, you know, our scripts, but maybe some of the logic that we've created. You know, geometries are geometries, like shapefiles are shapefiles. Like the logic is still going to be the same, even if the shapes are different. So the logic that we have in these scripts could potentially be shared, and I think that could potentially help other people speed along once they get to a place where they have. So that's kind of like my personal hope with this effort. But yeah. So anyway, thank you for your time today, and here are some links, and if anyone wanted to shoot me an email, that's my email address at work. So
Are you open for some questions, technical questions?
sure.
So if you're willing, I mean, we're still recording, so turn it off now, but if you're willing to share a little more about your process of the overlapping lands and how you do that, because that's a really interesting, juicy kind of.
Oh my God, sure. Let me see if I have a tab open here, and if I don't think I do.
Do you actually run every scenario of overlaps? Like, I'm trying to think about, like, it seems computationally like a lot to be like,
Well,
here's like this one overlap, and I'll go
Well-
one way on this one, but not on anything else, and then like do it for every single one. Seems like,
Also offer as a resource, you can use the whiteboards. I can train the camera on the board, so if you wanted to draw something, you're welcome to as well. Depending on how your brain works, just to make.
Well, let me see if I can pull up my little spreadsheet, or not spreadsheet, but little.
the tangential question that I was kind of curious about was, have you run an analysis on how often your data conflicts with like the PAD US?
I also note Nate put in the chat, he says he'd like to chime in on a couple of things, and maybe while you're looking for stuff, maybe Nate can.
Sure. Yeah, no, Nate, you're welcome to chime in.
Yeah, thank you. So one of the first things, thank you, Daria, so much, you and GreenInfo Network. What Michelle alluded to as well as yourselves. Um, California would not have been able to get to where we are if it hadn't been for literally the decades of investment into these data. They were a foundation that was essential to it. And if we'd gotten this mandate without the past work that had gone into it, both on the data side as well as the thinking through a lot of these issues, we would not have been able to deliver on the time frame that we did, or with the confidence that we have in what we've got there, that we do have. A question came up earlier about where the sort of 30 by 30 came from. And you were, I think there's a number of ways to think about how the timeline for it happened. But a lot of it came originally from a newspaper article in the New York Times and some associated writings by E.O. Wilson, reaching back to about 2016, where he was working on the Half Earth project, which sort of said, hey, to really protect, I think it was 95% of the planet's currently extant biodiversity, we need conservation over about 50% of its land area. And a lot of us in a lot of folks said, hey, 50 is a big jump, a big step. We need an intermediate step to set our sights on that's more immediately achievable. And that's sort of the backstory on the origination of 30 by 30 is as a hopefully, and that's me saying it as an individual, hopefully as a stepping stone to a higher achievement than just 30%. It's also worth noting, and you alluded to it, that there is a great deal of variation in county achievement of the 30%. Similarly, there's a great deal of variation across different ecological regions and types within the state, that while they're not explicitly identified in our 30 by 30 goal, there are a lot of us that are keeping an eye on that and hoping to really be more effective in conserving the diversity of biodiversity in the state, not just a single numeric target. So thank you, Daria. The work that you and GreenInfo Network have done is invaluable to this process.
You're very welcome, Nate. I love doing this every day, so I find it very important. So you're welcome. Okay, so yeah, I created a little document which I'll be honest, I haven't looked in a couple months. so I don't have it fresh in my mind. But the idea was that yeah, I came up with these 3 different models I looked at case scenarios where we imagine that there's, first of all, okay, so if you have and maybe I should use the board because I think it would, or maybe we could just look at this. I don't know.
Whatever makes you happy, I can work the camera, so.
Well, I guess let's start by doing this, looking at it here and seeing if it makes sense, and we can get to the whiteboard if need be. But so if you imagine there being, you know, two shapes, so one of them being CPAD and one of them being CCD, and they're overlapping in a certain area, so the non-overlapping sections, we say, okay, whatever gap codes they told us is for that area, that's what we're gonna take. And the acreage we're gonna calculate, we're gonna, you know, slice out whatever overlap is there, and then we're gonna essentially say, okay, this many acres go to that gap code that they told us about, and same for the other shape. But then for the overlapping area, first of all, we have to think about it this way. We have to think about how are those gap codes going to be distributed, because how is that gap acreage being distributed? Because if you think about a piece of land and they told us that, you know, a certain percentage of it, let's say they told us that 40% of it is gap 1. You can say, okay, well, that has been evenly, if you imagine it being evenly distributed within, say, the yellow shape or the blue shape, then you can say, okay, 40% of that overlap, we can imagine is gap 1. And then, so that's like one scenario, one way of thinking about it. Now, the other way of thinking about it is, what if we have a minimum of gap acreage in that overlap? So if they told us that 40% of the yellow shape is gap 1, we can assume, can we assume that none of that is in the overlap? And then the third scenario is where we assume that essentially as many of those gap 1 acres are going to end up in that overlap. So it's and so I mean, I feel like I probably need another hour to really go through all the scenarios and all the math that is involved, because so that's like the 3 big categories, but within each of those categories you then have to say, okay, what if we assume that these people are right and these people are wrong? So what will the gap acreage end up being in that overlap? And you have to do it for each scenario. And then in the end, you have to think about, okay, so essentially what ends up being my total max and total min, or, you know, how far apart are those? And thankfully so after we ran this analysis, and currently, because we don't have, CPAD compared to CCD, CPAD, we have 49.8 million acres, CCD, we have 2.4 million acres. The overlap isn't huge. It's not a huge amount of overlap. When we ran these models, essentially we found that, where is it? Let's see. So the results of this analysis showed that the amount of protected land falls between, and so if we looked at those 3 scenarios and we said, okay, what is the minimum amount of gap 1 and 2 acreage that falls within that overlap based on our, you know, those 3 models. And then, so if we took that number and added it to the non-overlapping areas, we got 24,712,560 million acres. And then if we said, what is the maximum amount of overlap? What is the maximum number of gap 1 and 2 acres that falls in that overlapping space based on those 3 models? We end up with 24,760,987 million acres. So yeah, it's not a huge difference, right? It's actually, 48,000 acres plus 48,000 acres is not a totally huge difference. So in some way, that's it was very encouraging. It's going to become interesting as we get more and more data into CCD, how this is going to change, because I don't know where we are in terms of how many of the lands out there that are conservation easements are in CCD, but I know there's still a lot out there that aren't in CCD. So as CCD grows, this number is definitely probably going to grow. And hopefully it will still not be a significant number, you know, but it could be. And a lot of this number could be that we just need to go in and fix some boundaries, fix some of the geometry. Like some of it could really be coming down to that. Although from when I did look at that, and when I looked at, okay, how much of this overlap is just silly slivering and, you know, other type of issues like that are just a silliness. It wasn't a big part of it. It was, the majority of it was legitimate overlaps. you know, of big areas actually overlapping, not slivering. Yeah. So I don't know if we want to dive into this. Do we want to dive into the maps? Do we want to? I can also give it to you.
I think you answered my question, which was you
Yeah.
just did 3 scenarios. And once you did that 3 scenario for every intersecting combination,
Yes.
then you could easily just do the mids, the max, and the mid.
Yeah. We ran it on every single overlap.
Yeah.
We did. Yes.
Yeah, that answered mine of like, you split it, yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's a really interesting, both geometry and.
It was,
Yeah.
to me, it was fascinating. I'm happy to provide you with scripts, if any of you are interested. I mean, I feel like I commented the script pretty well, so in terms of the logic, it shouldn't be, well, this part is not commented too well.
I was more curious about like the theoretical like underpinning of the
Sure.
splits.
Sure, yeah,
Like there's a way more complicated way to go, which is like now that you have the min and the max and sort of the middle. You could run a bunch of scenarios or combinations of those to see like how much it changes.
oh, that's true, yeah, I think.
But that's not really necessary for what you need to know.
No, we thought about doing that, but then we realized, well, we don't really need to know that. Because first of all, it's such a small difference, and second of all, we really need to know just the range and not how it varies. You know, depending on, the choices.
I mean, it's already weird enough that a particular polygon has 2 percentages.
Yeah.
Or could have 2 percentages because it has some gap 1 and some gap 2. Although,
Which we put ourselves in that position, so. It
what
was,
happens, do you ever have polygons that actually have some gap and some not gap as part of the same polygon?
Yeah. So we do, I know, I
So is
know.
there like a not gap assignment for percentage in some way?
Oh, well, I guess by not gap, I guess I think about that as gap 4. But really it's, because gap 4 is essentially everything that is not in any way conserved or protected. So I guess to answer your question, no, everything that is, not assigned ends up being a gap 4 or ends up being assigned a gap 4. Essentially, when we get the tool packages returned, all the percentages have to add up to 100, and if something doesn't add up to 100, we put the rest in the gap 4.
Okay, that answers that.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
So, because that's what gap 4 is. Gap 4 implies there's no protection or conservation, so that's what it is.
Yeah. And I like the idea of these different scenarios. That's what is interesting. Thanks for sharing with us.
No, it was a fun little like challenge for me. I do have a background in physics, and so for me, I was like, oh yeah, I get to go back to and do some math. And so that was really fun for me. It was fun for me to think about. You know, it's a geometry problem, so it was a fun one. Yeah, any other questions or anything else you might want to see? I know we're almost at time, but
I do have one more question. I don't know if this falls in your purview, but as you're reaching out with other agencies and I know there will be more lands coming up. If there's like existing lands that don't have the gap information, are those holders or owners, are those people incentivized in some way to fill out your stuff and turn it in so you can get this show on the road?
yeah, so I believe that part of the incentive comes from there being some funding. I don't know. I feel like I don't know how if I'm qualified to speak to any of this because I don't know enough. And so I'm a little hesitant to say anything that implies this, but I think that there is funding out there that people can get if their lands are gap 1 or 2. So essentially, I think it incentivizes people to review their lands with the gap codes and see how many of their lands would fall under gap 1 and 2 category, because I think then they can get funding from the state, but I'm not 100% sure on that. But it's from, just from conversations that I've had with some of the agencies out there, that's kind of what I've picked up on. Because I think some of them are worried about, there's a lot of discussion around these gap codes and how they can be applied to local lands, because they were meant to be applied to federal lands, and federal lands are managed in a very consistent way across all federal lands. There's a consistent system of management, whereas local lands, how one nonprofit manages their lands compared to another nonprofit, compared to a land trust, compared to this, compared to that. So there's a lot of variation, and those management practices, and the intent that they have is just not really, the gap code definitions are, I think, not detailed enough to really capture all the different scenarios of management and intent. And so, you know, there are some lands that are being, for example, there's grazing or ranching allowed on, well, some lands have grazing and ranching, like some of the land trusts, like the Mid-Peninsula Open Space, Mid-Peninsula Open Space Trust, I don't know.
Is it not mid-open?
What?
Mid-open?
Yeah, I think so. They are a land trust and they own a ton of lands. The same with Post, which is the Peninsula Open Space Trust. They own a ton of lands and have conservation easements on a ton of lands in the peninsula, but they allow grazing on a lot of them. And, you know, they say that, okay, these grazing practices are in line with what we actually need for those, like, you know, we need to have animals mowing down the grass essentially. And they say that it helps with native vegetation to, you know, it keeps down the non-native grasses and allows the native grasses to thrive better. I'm not an expert, I'm taking their word on it. So, you know, but there are other agencies that think that shouldn't be okay, like that should not be, those should not be lands that qualify as 30 by 30 lands, because it has essentially a human imposed disturbance on it.
Mhm.
So there are varying opinions on how gap codes can be applied, but I think we're coming closer and closer to a consensus on what can be allowed and what cannot be allowed on certain lands. And I forget what the original question was that led me to this one. So
Just wondered if people were incentivized somehow to
yeah.
turn their data into
Yeah,
you.
so I guess what I was trying to say is there's a lot of complexity happening around, you know, there's a lot of conversation on, okay, is my land actually a gap 2 or is it a gap 3? And the difference between gap 2 and 3 can be essentially down to, do we want to allow grazing on those lands, or do we say no grazing allowed? Because if no grazing is allowed, then your land is going to be gap 3. If we want to allow grazing, then it's going to be gap 2. And so that conversation is ongoing, and I think agencies and organizations are interested in the sense that they want to keep things moving along and hopefully keep them moving along in a direction that, you know, they have to convince and provide evidence in some way that this is for the better, and that their management practices are in line with conservation efforts. So yes, I would say there is a lot of interest, but it's complicated and frustrating for a lot of agencies, because that are in a position where their lands are on the one way or the other. So agencies and organizations that I think know their lands are pretty much gap 1 or 2. I think it's a very easy process for them, but agencies and organizations that are on the border, yeah, there's we have been getting feedback of there being, I suppose, some frustration over not knowing which way to go. And thankfully, we're getting to, like I said, a place where there's greater definition within the, like there greater clarity within the definitions for gap codes. So hopefully that frustration on their part will be eased. And hopefully, yeah, it will be able to, because I do think that a lot of organizations out there, land trusts, etc., I do think that they try to manage for conservation to the best of the knowledge that's out there currently. And I know that there are a lot of there is the merit to grazing practices. Now, I think it depends on how those grazing practices are, what you know, exactly how much grazing is allowed, or where exactly it's allowed.
What time of year,
Okay, yeah,
which
exactly.
grazer type,
Yes. So,
how long they're allowed to stay on.
yeah,
No, I know,
Right.
that's a whole thorny, like, I'd much
Yeah.
rather be running the code than be sitting
Yeah.
in on these public meetings on how to language thing.
yeah, absolutely. So, it's definitely, I think, a challenge, in that regard, but I think there's increasing consensus on what can be allowed and what cannot. So I think, for example, when it comes to, there are conservation easements that have crops, you know, like there's a bunch of conservation easements with, vineyards. And, you know, it's all organic, etc., you know, and supposedly, it's like habitat for Swainson hawks, I believe. A lot of those vineyards are good habitat for Swainson hawks, but, you know, is that enough? And I think right now the conversation is, for example, that particular scenario is not enough, because the vast majority of the land is cultivated, and so it's not in a natural state, right? Even though it is Swanson hawk habitat, so it would qualify as, say, gap 3, but not gap 2.
I think that's where the part Nate was talking about, like, to me, this feels like the input data set that you would then go and do a bunch of biodiversity analysis. And you could look at some of the things that got marked as gap 3 or gap 2 and be like, do they actually provide biodiversity? Because like in that case, like, yes, it's important to have single species. It could be a listed species, but one species does not make an ecosystem.
Right.
So
Exactly. They're not lands that you could, yeah, I mean, because they're cultivated, I think you cannot have agendas that further conservation, you know, because I think at some distant future, we would want to, there's definitely some people out there who want to have these lands not just be, you know, sitting there, but to have practices on these lands that stewardship practices on these lands that really help those ecosystems thrive, not just, you know, because there's a lot that needs to happen in order to have a thriving ecosystem, and currently a lot of those lands don't have a thriving ecosystem, even though they are conserved at a gap 1 and gap 2 level. They don't necessarily, like, the amount of biodiversity on that land might not actually be, you know, how much, gap status doesn't actually measure biodiversity levels. It measures protection levels and conservation intent, but it doesn't measure actual biodiversity. So that's like, I mean, in some faraway future, that would be the next step, is to get to a place where we have matching biodiversity levels with maybe the gap status code, but or maybe a different system that would measure that. But yeah. So anyhow,
We really appreciate your time coming to talk to us about this really important project and sharing all your insights and your code, and that was really great. Thank you so much.
oh, you're very welcome. You're very welcome. This is fun for me. Should I stop sharing or?